All right. Welcome to Culture Critics Part 2. Yeah, good. So last week I opened the service reading y'all some poetry. I read a little ditty from Olivia Rodrigo, and then a poetic phrase from Drake. And the point we were kind of making was, are we paying attention to what is filling our lives? And so I went after music a little bit last week, and so I thought I can't go back there just yet. So there was a TV show that one of the most popular shows in the world recently. I know some of you have seen it, and so I was thinking about this show because it blew up, and it was based on a book. And how many of you like to read the book before you watch the movie? Or right, 3 of you. That's what I thought. So for those of you who haven't read the book, what's interesting is that the story. The story is a little wild, and so I wanted to kind of see what you guys thought, because in this story it's kind of a thing, and this is why it appeals to young people. It's about a teenage guy who kind of the outcast in his crew, outcast in his family. His family's part of a big kind of like a gang, and but he's left out, and so there's a moment where he gets to prove himself. There's a rivalry, and the other gang essentially has a giant bully, and so kind of the story really kicks off when this young teenager kills the guy, right? So he kills the guy, and then things kind of blow up from there, and it just gets it's like there's a lot of violence in it. So I don't know if you're sensitive to violence. There's a ton of violence in it. There's a bunch of sexual content in there. There's language in there. There's even some in the book there's nudity, and it's not sexual, but it's like a guy he ends up mutilating people. It's a crazy kind of story. And so as Christians, how should we feel about those kinds of things? Now, obviously, some of you are tracking and you know exactly what TV show I'm talking about. The TV show is way safer than the book. The TV show was House of David, and the book was the Bible. Particularly for Samuel, where this young teenage boy named David kills Goliath, and then kills Philistines and chops off their genitals, and then is part of a there's rape in this story, there's incest in this story, there's murder in this story. There's Saul in 1 Samuel 20:30. Saul cusses at Jonathan. So last week, how many of you saw that coming? Yeah, hands down. Get out of here. All right, so last week we made this big point. Well, last week we made this big point about Jesus says, from the overflow of the heart, your mouth will speak. And so what you fill your life with is going to end up coming out into your life. And so at the end of the night, I gave so many of you a challenge, and I said, hey, some of you need to begin to fill your life with what's godly. How many of you were intentional this week about adding some things into your life? Maybe it was reading, maybe it was listening to better music. Good, come on, I love that. So good. And then the other part of the challenge I gave was, hey, some of you need to pull things out of your life. You need to remove things out of your life that are maybe they're wicked, maybe they're bad for your soul, maybe you see the influence that they have. How many of you were intentional about taking some things, or you were mindful, you were just a little pickier about, good, come on, I love this. Okay, good. And I think one of the challenges is that feels like an undeveloped filter. I told you at the beginning of the series that what we're going to do through this series is I'm going to talk to you about how do we as Christians, how are we supposed to handle what is going on in the culture? How are we supposed to participate in the world around us? How are we supposed to understand media? How are we supposed to be in these things? And so I told you it was going to take more than 1 week. Some of you last week ended thinking that essentially the only filter that Christians should have is we add really good things and we get rid of every bad thing. But the problem is that the Bible is actually filled with real humans. It would be great if there were no humans in the whole Bible, right? Because humans tend to mess a ton of stuff up. But in fact, the story has a lot to do with God and humans are in the Bible, which means that we read the Bible and we don't make it more than 3 chapters before people start messing stuff up. And then the next chapter is just as crazy, and then a couple chapters later is even crazier, and then a few chapters after that is worse, and then it just continues in crescendos over and over and over again. And that's why Jesus had to come. But last week we talked about this idea that we need to have a filter on what it is that we are allowing into our lives. And yet, one of the challenges is that if the filter is only get rid of anything that is kind of bad and only listen to good, like I don't even know that we can watch like Bubble Guppies anymore. Like I don't even know that like Paw Patrol is allowed. Like I don't know, how far does this go? You following? And so I want to introduce tonight what I think is the next filter. How is it that, what is the next filter? If you got a Bible, go with me to 1 Corinthians. Go with me to the book of 1 Corinthians. And I want to give us tonight another lens, another filter, another way that we need to be evaluating what is coming into our lives. And so just a little bit of background on this. In 1 Corinthians, Paul writes his letter to Corinth, but we read 1 Corinthians. How many of you think 1 Corinthians is the 1 Corinthians? It's not. It's probably the 2 Corinthians. That's slightly confusing. But here's what it means. It means that Paul is writing a response to the church in Corinth. And so what we have is his response to this. And so in 1 Corinthians, we're reading what Paul wrote after some people had written to Paul and been like, hey, Paul, here are some ideas that we're kicking around. Here are some things. And this 1 Corinthians, I think, is a really good book for any of you who really want to wrestle more with the conversation we're having about media, about culture, about convictions, about conscience. Like 1 Corinthians is going to be really good for this because in the Corinthian church, you've got some people who have very different ideas about what should be allowed and what shouldn't be allowed. Like you had some people who grew up Jewish under a very strict law of rules and ethics and principles. And so for them, almost everything is bad. Like they're like, they're very strict on what you can do on Saturdays. They're strict about what clothes you wear. They're strict about how you do your hair. They're strict about what food you eat, what food you don't eat, what days you have holidays, what days you don't have holidays. Everything has a rule. But then you flip that, and the other half of the church, they grew up as Roman citizens, but they grew up with Greek culture, kind of the way that like if you were to go to another country, American culture kind of still has a loud voice. Even though you would walk into a country and you would see their culture, you would still see some American culture. It was the same way with, like, there was Greek culture, and everybody was kind of doing Greek stuff. And Greek culture was a little crazier. Their rules were way different. And so when these two groups, the Jews who became Christian and the Greeks who became Christian, they start to do church together, they start to see things in one another, and they start to go, hey, I think what you're doing is wrong. And the other one was like, I think what you're doing is wrong. And they couldn't find who was right. And so they write to Paul, and they're like, hey, Paul, we got an idea. We think this is what's happening. And so what they had kind of put together was this thing where they were like, hey, Paul, I think the rule is everybody should be allowed to do whatever they want. Everybody should be allowed to do whatever they want, whatever feels good to you, because everybody's kind of coming at this from different perspectives. So what if we just all do whatever we want? Because if we do something bad, God will forgive us. So let's just see how this plays out. 1 Corinthians 6, verse 12. Paul responds to them and he says, you say, I'm allowed to do anything. And that was their argument. Hey, maybe we can just maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe it just doesn't matter. Maybe if a song sounds bad to you, but it doesn't sound bad to me, it doesn't matter. Maybe if a movie is bad to you, but not to me, it doesn't matter. Maybe if, fill in the blanks. Maybe it doesn't matter, but Paul responds, but not everything is, say that word, good. Not everything is good for you. And even though I'm allowed to do anything, I must not become a slave to anything. Paul responds by saying, hey, let's be mindful of something real quick. There are going to be things that you shouldn't be allowed to do, and there are going to be some things that you are allowed to do, and not everything is good for you, and not everything is equal. So he continues on, and it's going to be a strange argument, but I need you to follow. 1 Corinthians 6:13, he says, you say that food was made for the stomach, and the stomach for food. This is true, though someday God will do away with both of them. Here's what they were arguing. They were saying, hey, listen, the body was made to eat. And so if the body was made to eat, let's just let it eat. In the same kind of way, we could apply this and we could say, hey, the ears were made to enjoy, so let's just enjoy it. Hey, the eyes were made to appreciate, so let's just appreciate it. He says the stomach was made for food, and food for the stomach. Here's how they were applying it, though. They were applying it a little differently. They were using this analogy to say, they were running this idea all the way to its logical end. And they said, well, if something was made for something, then it should be completely free. And the way the 1 Corinthians church was running this is they were saying, well, some of us have strict rules about who you can have sex with. And the rest of us think you should be able to have sex with everybody. And if the stomach was made for food and food for the stomach, and the body was made for sex and sex for the body, then we should just be able to have sex with everybody. And if you don't want to have sex with everybody, then you don't have to have sex with everybody, but I should be able to have sex with everybody. That was the logic. And most of us are really shocked by that idea. Why? Because that's a terrible idea. Run that to its logical end, and that's actually a terrible idea. And so Paul is pointing out, guys, this doesn't work. You can't just say that because part of it has a use together, that all of it works together. You can't just say the sum is equal to all of the parts. And so Paul goes, this is a broken analogy. But you have to keep reading in 1 Corinthians to read what he actually says is a helpful solution. Here's what's really fun about the book of 1 Corinthians. Have you ever started a conversation with somebody, and in the middle of that conversation, they're like telling you a story, and they're like, da, 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 and then they get interrupted, and they start talking about a different thing altogether. And it takes them 5 minutes, and then they go, oh, back to my story. That happens in 1 Corinthians 6, and then in 1 Corinthians 8, and then 1 Corinthians 10. So Paul takes 6 chapters to finish his sentence, all right? So here's what happens. We got to jump. 1 Corinthians 8. Follow with me. 1 Corinthians 8. He continues this conversation about what do we do with our conscience? How should we respond when we disagree about those things? And he brings up a brand new topic, verse 4. What about eating meat that has been offered to idols? Now, I recognize immediately that I have done probably 70 Q&As in Vox up here. We've done a ton of things like this. I've counseled people. I've sat with them in my office. We've done all kinds of things. I have never had somebody come to me and go, hey, dang, bro, listen. I've been taking my food and leaving it at a Buddha shrine, and is that bad? Like, that's not a conversation that most of us have. Now, here's the thing. It is a real thing that is still happening today. Like, people still in Asian countries bring food, predominantly in Buddhism, in Hinduism. They bring food to an idol as an offering, as this thing. This is what it looks like in 2026, which I think is hilarious. Like Starbucks and boba as like a Krishna, please. All right, so but right. So this is the scenario. The scenario is that some people in the church would be invited to Greek worship services where there was food that was being offered to demons. And these Christians were going, hey, you know what? I'm not bothered. I'm not scared of demons. So I should be able to eat that food. And I should be able to go to this party. And there shouldn't be anything wrong with this. And then the other group was going, hey, I know that you've grown up. I know that that's part of your culture. But that's not what we should do. And so Paul begins, and he says, what about eating meat that has been offered to idols? We all know that an idol is not really a god, and that there is only one God. And this is a conversation that the Bible has so many times. Isaiah 45:5, I'm the Lord, there is no other God. Exodus 20, you must not have any other God but me. You must not make for yourself an idol of any kind or an image of anything in the heavens or on the earth. And yet, idols still exist. Not just statues, not just these things. I love the definition that Pastor Tim Keller gives it in the book Counterfeit Gods. He says, what is an idol? It's anything more important to you than God. Anything that absorbs your heart and imagination more than God. Anything you seek to give you what only God can give. And if that's the definition of an idol, then we have plenty of things that we worship at. I think there are plenty of things that we could say, oh, that has dominance in my life. Oh, that has kingship in my life. Oh, that has reign in my life. Oh, that's what calls the shots in my life. And what happens is, this church in Corinth was wrestling over, should we be really strict about culture, or should we be very open about culture? And in verse 9, Paul continues, you must be careful so that your freedom does not cause others with a weaker conscience to stumble. Paul says that whatever you do if it has an effect on other people, then you need to be mindful of the effect that you have on other people. So, yes, Jesus says, from the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. And so we go, okay, what am I allowing in? What is full in my life? What is filling in my life? I need to be careful that I'm not bringing in evil and putting wicked things before my eyes. But Paul comes along and says, we also aren't just mindful of how it affects me, but how does this affect other people? Does what I do encourage or discourage other people? And he goes on to flesh this out more. He says, when you sin against other believers by encouraging them to do something they believe is wrong, you are sinning against Christ. Paul takes this crazy standard and he says, wait, let me say something here. Even if there was something and it was okay for you, but by doing it, encouraged somebody else to do something wrong, it's bad for you. In fact, by doing it, you would be sinning against them. So it's interesting, when we think about this, the question is, what does what I'm consuming, what effect does it have? I really want to encourage you to go back to this passage in 1 Corinthians 6 and 1 Corinthians 8 and 1 Corinthians 10. You could read in between. I don't care. It's all good. It's actually really good. You'll learn some stuff, I promise. But there's so much more to what Paul is saying here. But he ends with, I think, a much simpler filter. Because we could kind of get stuck. Paul then goes and he says, okay, let me run through a couple scenarios. What if you're invited to eat meat at a party, but you don't know if that meat was sacrificed to idols? What do you do about that? What if you're at the party and you didn't know it was sacrificed to idols, and then somebody comes to you and says, hey, I think that was sacrificed to idols. What do we do? He runs through all of these scenarios. And I think for most of us, we would get really confused going, okay, wait, what do I do about this? What do I do about this? What do I do about this? But he ends it with something that I think is really, really, really simple. And it's really, really, really helpful. And it's this: whatever you do, do it for God. Whatever you do, do it for God. And this is how he wraps this in 1 Corinthians 10:31. He says, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do it all for the glory of God. He says, don't give offense to Jews or Gentiles or the church of God. He says, I try to please everyone in everything I do. I don't just do what is best for me. I do what is best for others, so that many may be saved. And you should imitate me just as I imitate Christ. I love this Pauline filter. I love what he says at the end of this. I love what Paul says. Hey, whatever you do, how about this? Do it for God. So here's what that looks like. If I'm gonna listen to something or watch something, does this glorify you? Maybe the answer is yes. Maybe the answer is no. Maybe the answer is yes and it's surprising. Maybe the answer is no and it's surprising. But whatever you do it for the glory of God. Here's what I want to encourage you in this week. In the same way that last week I challenged many of you to add or take away things, this week I want you to do something for me. Most of us sleep next to our phone. And the first thing that you do when you wake up is you grab that thing and you begin to see, okay, what happened on social media? What's in my feed? What's in this? You probably don't even do it consciously. In fact, you're probably still like half asleep, grumpy. But we're looking at this, and here's what I want to ask. Before we grab for this, before we do anything, tomorrow, for the rest of this week, I want you to do something. I want you to pray a simple prayer. And when you wake up, I want you to say, hey, God, everything I do today, would you help me try to do it in a way that glorifies you? Everything I listen to, everything I watch, everything I pursue, everything I chase, could you help me do it in a way that glorifies you? And that might mean that there are some things that you don't do. Do you know why? Because you can't find a way that this glorifies God. And you go, I might have to skip this. And this is what Paul means when he says we don't become a slave to anything. For some of you, I think you're scared because that could seem really hard. But Paul says this, and I think it's actually really helpful. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 12, it's part of this same flow of logic, part of this same conversation. He says, if you think you're standing strong, be careful not to fall. In other words, he's just saying, hey, if you plan on ignoring this, be really careful. If you think, I don't need to do that, I already got it, I'm fine, the way I live is perfectly fine. He says, hey, you need to be really careful. If you think you're standing strong, be careful not to fall. But then he says this, and this is really helpful. He says, the temptations in your life are no different from what others experience. And God is faithful. He'll not allow the temptation to be more than you can stand. When you're tempted, He'll show you a way out so that you can endure. If this feels difficult, let me tell you right now that you're not doing anything that others aren't already doing. You're not doing anything that the Lord can't help you do. You're not doing anything that God doesn't have a way out for. In fact, God has a better way forward for you. So this week, let's apply this filter to our lives. God, is what I'm doing pleasing to you? Here's what I want us to do. As we end this night, we're going to go into another song of worship, and I want you to have a prayer in this song. And it's, God, what in my life is not pleasing to you? God, what in my life is not being done for your glory? God, what in my life am I allowing in that I need you to bring up? And he might bring up some things. I don't know. He might bring up a game that you go, yeah, maybe that's not right. Maybe it's a relationship. Maybe it's, I don't know what it is, but you're going to have to ask the Lord. So I'm going to pray for us, and then let's stand and let's enter in. Father God, would you meet us here tonight? Would you give us discernment? Would you help us think of the things that are in our life that aren't being done for you, for your glory, for your name, for your sake? Would you bring them to our mind right now? Would you help us this week do everything for you, for your name? We praise you, Jesus.